The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, and I knew before opening it that Patricia Alderson had found something new to complain about. I was right. The Cascade Ridge Homeowners Association, in all its infinite wisdom, had decided that my snowmobile was no longer welcome on the mountain trails that I had been riding for the past 15 years. I stood in my kitchen in Bend, Oregon, reading the letter 3 times to make sure I was not hallucinating. Patricia, the HOA president and the most insufferable woman I had ever met, had written in her characteristic condescending tone that snowmobiles were now considered disruptive to the peaceful mountain atmosphere and incompatible with the family-friendly environment we strive to maintain. The ban was effective immediately, and any violation would result in a $500 fine per incident. My name is Brandon Xerxes, and I have lived in Cascade Ridge for 7 years. I bought my cabin here specifically because of the access to thousands of acres of pristine mountain trails. I am a software engineer who sold my startup 3 years ago for enough money to live comfortably and pursue my hobbies, which primarily consisted of snowmobiling in winter and mountain biking in summer. The trails were not HOA property. They were part of a larger mountain system that included both private and public land, but Patricia had somehow convinced the board that they had jurisdiction over what residents could do on adjacent properties. I picked up my phone and called my lawyer, Marcus Thompson. He had handled the sale of my company and remained on retainer for exactly these kinds of situations. "Marcus, I need you to look into something for me," I said when he answered. "Good morning to you too, Brandon. What has Patricia done now?" Marcus knew about Patricia. Everyone in Bend who dealt with property law knew about Patricia. She had been president of the Cascade Ridge HOA for 8 years and treated the position like she was the mayor of a small nation rather than the volunteer administrator of a neighborhood association. "She is banning snowmobiles from the mountain trails. Can she do that?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Send me the letter. I will look into the exact boundaries and ownership of the trails in question." "But Brandon, even if she is overstepping, fighting this through official channels could take months." "I am not interested in fighting through official channels," I said. "I want to know who owns the land, the trails, the whole mountain." Marcus laughed, then realized I was serious. "You want to buy a mountain? I want to know if it is possible," he sighed. "Give me a few days. I will do some research." I hung up and looked out my kitchen window at the snow-covered slopes of Mount Bachelor in the distance. Cascade Ridge was a development of about 40 homes built on the lower slopes of a smaller peak called Evergreen Mountain. The mountain itself was owned by a timber company that had gone bankrupt in the early 2000s. The land had been in some kind of legal limbo ever since, with various creditors and investors claiming pieces of it. The HOA had no actual ownership of anything beyond the residential lots and common areas like the clubhouse and the small park near the entrance. That evening I went to the monthly HOA meeting. I rarely attended these circuses, but I wanted to confront Patricia directly. The meetings were held in the clubhouse, a modest building with a meeting room, a kitchen, and a small gym that nobody used. About 20 residents were scattered across the folding chairs when I arrived. Patricia stood at the front near a podium shuffling papers and chatting with her 2 closest allies on the board, Deborah Martinez and Susan Chen. Patricia was exactly what you would expect. 53 years old, blonde hair styled in that aggressive suburban bob designer athleisure where that had never seen actual athletic activity, and an expression of perpetual disapproval. She noticed me immediately, and her eyes narrowed. "Brandon," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "how nice of you to join us. We see you so rarely at these meetings." "I had a reason to come tonight," I said, taking a seat in the back row. The meeting began with the usual tedious business. Reports on landscaping contracts, discussion of the budget for repainting the clubhouse, a heated debate about whether decorative garden gnomes should be allowed in front yards. Patricia ruled over all of it with an iron fist, cutting off anyone who disagreed with her and steamrolling through votes before people could raise objections. Finally, we reached new business. "I want to discuss the new recreational vehicle policy," Patricia announced. "As outlined in the letter sent to all residents this week, the board has voted to ban snowmobiles and other loud motorized recreational vehicles from the trails adjacent to our community." A few people nodded. Most looked confused. I raised my hand. "I have a question." Patricia looked like she had bitten into a lemon. "Yes, Brandon. On what authority is the HOA banning anything from trails that are not HOA property?" "The trails are accessed through our community," Patricia said. "Therefore, we have the right to regulate what kind of traffic uses them." "That is not how property rights work," I said. "You cannot ban me from using public or private land that you do not own just because I have to drive past your house to get there." "The board has consulted with our attorney," Patricia said, her voice getting sharper. "And we are well within our rights to enforce community standards." "Who is your attorney?" I asked. "That is none of your concern." "It absolutely is my concern if the HOA is spending my dues on legal advice to restrict my legal activities." A few other residents started murmuring. Patricia slammed her hand on the podium. "This is not up for debate, Brandon. The policy has been voted on and approved by the board. If you have an issue with it, you can file a formal complaint in writing, and we will consider it at next month's meeting." "I will do better than that," I said, standing up. "I will see you in court." I walked out to a stunned silence. Over the next week, Marcus worked his magic. The ownership situation of Evergreen Mountain was even more complicated than I had thought. The timber company, Cascade Lumber LLC, had gone bankrupt in 2003. The land had been seized by creditors and parceled out to various investment groups. Over the years, through mergers, acquisitions, and more bankruptcies, the ownership had fragmented into a maze of holding companies and shell corporations. But Marcus was good at mazes. "Here is the situation," he told me when we met at his office downtown. "The mountain is technically owned by 17 different entities, but 15 of those entities are subsidiaries or defunct branches of two main holding companies. One is based in Seattle, the other in Portland. I have made contact with both, and they are willing to sell." "What about the other two entities?" "One is a small family trust that owns about 40 acres on the North Slope. I spoke with the trustee, and he is open to selling. The last one is a property management company that owns the section of land directly behind the Cascade Ridge development. That is the parcel that includes most of the trails you ride on. Let me guess, they do not want to sell." "Actually, they do. The land has been a liability for them. No timber value, too expensive to develop, and they have been paying property taxes on it for 20 years with no return. They are asking $800,000 for their section." I did the math in my head. "What is the total for all of it?" Marcus slid a paper across the desk. $4.2 million for the entire mountain. That includes all 17 parcels, roughly 3,000 acres total. I had $7 million in liquid assets after taxes from the company sale, plus another few million in investments and retirement accounts. $4.2 million was a lot of money, but it was not going to bankrupt me. "Do it," I said. Marcus stared at me. "Brandon, I have to ask if you are serious. This is not buying a jet ski on impulse. This is a massive land purchase that will come with ongoing costs, taxes, liability issues, and probably years of legal headaches. I am completely serious. Draw up the offers. I want to own this mountain. Marcus nodded slowly. All right. But I am going on record saying that this is the most expensive act of spite I have ever witnessed. Spite is such an ugly word, I said. I prefer poetic justice. The purchase process took 6 weeks. During that time, Patricia sent me 2 more letters threatening legal action if I continued to use my snowmobile on the trails. I ignored both. I also started attending every HOA meeting, saying nothing but making Patricia visibly uncomfortable with my presence. She knew I was planning something but could not figure out what. The final closing was on a rainy morning in late March. I met with representatives from all the selling entities, signed what felt like 1,000 pages of documents, and transferred $4.2 million out of my accounts. By noon, I owned Evergreen Mountain. Marcus handed me a folder with all the deeds and titles. Congratulations! You are now the proud owner of 3,000 acres of Oregon wilderness. What are you going to do with it? First, I am going to have a conversation with Patricia. I drove straight to Patricia's house, a massive McMansion at the top of Cascade Ridge with a 3-car garage and a manicured lawn that looked like it belonged on a golf course. I parked in her driveway and rang the doorbell. She opened the door in yoga pants and a shocked expression. Brandon, what are you doing here? I wanted to deliver some news personally, I said. As of this morning, I own Evergreen Mountain, all of it. Every trail, every tree, every rock. Patricia blinked. That is impossible. I have the deeds right here if you would like to see them. I held up the folder. Which means that as of now, you and every other member of this HOA are banned from setting foot on my property. If I catch anyone hiking, skiing, or even walking their dog on those trails, I will have them arrested for trespassing. Her face went through several shades of red. You cannot do that. Actually, I can. It is private property now, and I get to decide who is allowed on it. And I have decided that nobody from Cascade Ridge HOA is welcome. That is insane. Those trails have been used by this community for decades. And I have been using them for 7 years until you decided to ban me. How does it feel, Patricia? She sputtered, unable to form words. I could see her mind racing, trying to find some angle, some argument, some way to regain control. This is harassment, she finally said. I am calling the police. Go ahead. Explain to them how I am harassing you by exercising my legal property rights on land I legally own. I am sure they will be very sympathetic. I turned and walked back to my truck, leaving Patricia standing in her doorway, shaking with rage. The fallout was immediate and glorious. By that evening, my phone was flooded with calls and texts from neighbors. Some were angry, some were confused, and a surprising number were congratulatory. It turned out that Patricia had made a lot of enemies over the years, and quite a few residents were thrilled to see her get a taste of her own medicine. Patricia called an emergency HOA meeting for the following evening. I showed up early and took a seat in the front row. The room was packed. Every resident in Cascade Ridge seemed to be there. Along with several people I did not recognize who I assumed were friends or family members people had brought for moral support. Patricia stood at the podium, looking like she had not slept. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. We have a crisis that needs to be addressed immediately. As some of you may have heard, Brandon Xerxes has purchased Evergreen Mountain and is threatening to ban our community from the trails. Not threatening, I called out. Definitely banning. Patricia glared at me. This is a catastrophe for our property values and our quality of life. Those trails are one of the main attractions of living in Cascade Ridge. Without access to them, Our homes could lose significant value. Perhaps you should have thought of that before you banned my snowmobile, I said. An older man named Gerald stood up. Patricia, is it true that you banned snowmobiles without actually having the authority to do so? We had every right to enforce community standards, Patricia snapped. But the trails are not HOA property, Gerald said. Several of us looked into it after the ban was announced. You exceeded your authority. I was acting in the best interests of the community. No, I said, standing up. You were acting like a petty tyrant who cannot stand the idea of anyone doing something you do not personally approve of. You have been doing it for years, banning garden gnomes, forcing people to repaint their houses every 5 years, fining people for parking their cars on the street overnight. You treat this HOA like your personal fiefdom. Several people started applauding. Patricia looked like she was about to have a stroke. If you do not restore trail access, I will sue you personally, she hissed. On what grounds? I am not breaking any laws. I own the land. I get to decide who uses it. That is how property ownership works in America. A woman named Helen raised her hand. Brandon, is there any way we can negotiate with you? Surely we can come to some arrangement. I looked around the room at all the faces staring at me. These were my neighbors. Most of them had nothing to do with Patricia's vendetta against me. They were just people who wanted to enjoy the mountain. Here is my offer, I said. Patricia resigns as HOA president, effective immediately. The board votes to rescind the snowmobile ban and issues a formal apology. And the HOA agrees to stop passing arbitrary rules without proper legal authority. If those 3 things happen, I will grant an easement allowing Cascade Ridge residents to access the trails. The room erupted in conversation. Patricia's face was purple. You cannot force me to resign. You are right. I cannot force you, but your neighbors can vote you out. And if they do not, they can enjoy not having access to the mountain they moved here for. Deborah, one of Patricia's closest allies on the board, stood up. Patricia, maybe we should consider this. Absolutely not. I will not be extorted by this man. It is not extortion, Deborah said quietly. He owns the land. He can do what he wants with it. And honestly, Patricia, maybe it is time to step down. You have been president for 8 years. Someone else can take over. Patricia looked around the room, searching for support. She found none. Even Susan, her other loyal board member, was avoiding eye contact. Fine, Patricia said, her voice shaking. I resign. Are you happy now, Brandon? Getting there, I said. Patricia grabbed her papers and stormed out of the clubhouse, slamming the door behind her. The room sat in stunned silence for a moment before Gerald stood up. I motion that we vote to rescind the snowmobile ban, he said. I second, Helen added. The vote was unanimous. Deborah, now the acting president, looked at me. Is that acceptable? One more thing, I said. The formal apology. Deborah sighed and picked up a pen. 5 minutes later, she handed me a signed letter on HOA letterhead apologizing for the overreach of authority and acknowledging that the snowmobile ban was improper. It was not the most heartfelt apology I had ever received, but it would do. I will have my lawyer draft the easement agreement, I said. It will grant trail access to all Cascade Ridge residents in good standing with the HOA. It will also explicitly allow snowmobiles, dirt bikes, mountain bikes, and any other recreational vehicles, as long as they are operated safely and responsibly. The room burst into applause. I nodded and walked out, feeling better than I had in months. Over the next few weeks, I worked with Marcus to formalize the trail access agreement. We included provisions for maintenance, liability waivers, and rules against littering or damaging the natural environment. I also hired a local land management company to help me develop a plan for the property. My goal was not just to spite Patricia, although that had been deeply satisfying. I actually wanted to do something good with the mountain. I started by marking out several new trails and clearing brush and fallen trees from the existing paths. I hired a small crew to install signage with trail maps and difficulty ratings. I created a simple website where people could check trail conditions and report any issues. The response from the community was overwhelmingly positive. People thanked me constantly when I was out on the trails, and several residents offered to volunteer to help with maintenance. Patricia, true to form, did not go quietly into the night. She moved out of Cascade Ridge within a month of resigning, selling her house at a loss because she could not stand the humiliation of staying. But before she left, she filed a lawsuit against me claiming that I had intentionally interfered with her property rights and caused emotional distress. The lawsuit was frivolous and was thrown out by a judge within 6 weeks, but it cost me $15,000 in legal fees to defend against it. I did not care. Watching Patricia's case get dismissed was worth every penny. With Patricia gone, the HOA underwent a dramatic transformation. Gerald was elected as the new president, and he immediately began rolling back many of the more ridiculous rules that Patricia had implemented over the years. Garden gnomes were allowed. The mandatory house repainting schedule was eliminated. Overnight street parking was permitted. The HOA became what it was supposed to be: a simple administrative body that maintained common areas and enforced basic standards, not an authoritarian regime. My relationship with my neighbors improved dramatically as well. I started hosting summer barbecues at my cabin and inviting people from the development. I organized group mountain biking trips and snowmobile excursions. The mountain, which I had bought out of anger and spite, became a genuine source of joy and community connection. But the story does not end there. In late May, I received a call from a man named Victor Walsh. He identified himself as a representative of a regional conservation nonprofit called the Cascade Wilderness Trust. "Mr. Xerxes, I understand you recently purchased Evergreen Mountain," Victor said. "I was hoping we could meet to discuss the property." I was immediately suspicious. "If you are calling to ask me to donate it or sell it for below market value, I am not interested," Victor laughed. "Nothing like that. I want to talk about a conservation easement." We met for coffee in downtown Bend the following week. Victor was in his early 60s, with gray hair and the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. He brought a folder full of maps and documents. "Here is the situation," he said, spreading a topographic map across the table. "Evergreen Mountain is part of a critical wildlife corridor connecting the Deschutes National Forest to several other protected areas. Elk, deer, black bears, and even a few wolves use this route for seasonal migration. But because the land has been privately owned and poorly managed for decades, the habitat has been degrading. I am working on improving the trails," I said, "and that is great for recreational use. But what I am proposing is a legal agreement that would permanently protect the mountain from development while still allowing you to own it and use it however you want. You would get significant tax benefits, and the land would be preserved for future generations." I listened as Victor explained how conservation easements worked. Essentially, I would retain ownership of the property and could continue to use it for recreation, but I would give up the right to develop it commercially. In exchange, I would receive substantial tax deductions, and the land would be monitored by the trust to ensure it remained ecologically healthy. "How substantial are we talking about for the tax benefits?" I asked. Victor did some quick calculations. "Based on the appraised value of the development rights you would be giving up, probably in the range of $2 to $3 million in deductions spread over several years. That got my attention. The property taxes on 3,000 acres were not cheap, and I had been looking for ways to offset the ongoing costs of ownership. "I will think about it," I said. I spent the next 2 weeks researching conservation easements and talking to Marcus about the legal implications. The more I learned, the more sense it made. I had bought the mountain to keep it from being controlled by Patricia and to preserve my access to the trails. A conservation easement would accomplish both of those goals permanently, even after I was gone. I called Victor and told him I was interested. We spent the next 3 months working through the details. The Cascade Wilderness Trust conducted ecological surveys of the property, identifying critical habitats and migration routes. We negotiated the exact terms of the easement, making sure I retained the right to maintain and expand recreational trails while protecting sensitive areas from overuse. The paperwork was finalized in September. I signed the easement agreement, permanently protecting Evergreen Mountain from development. The story made the local news, and I was surprised by the outpouring of support from the community. Environmental groups praised the decision, and I received dozens of messages from people thanking me for preserving the land. But while all of this positive progress was happening, Patricia was quietly plotting her revenge. In early October, I received a notice from the Deschutes County Planning Department. Someone had filed a complaint alleging that I was operating an unpermitted recreational facility on Evergreen Mountain and that I was violating county zoning ordinances. The complaint was anonymous, but I knew exactly who had filed it. Marcus and I met with the county planner assigned to investigate the complaint, a tired-looking woman named Rebecca, who seemed annoyed at having to deal with what was clearly a nuisance filing. "Mr. Xerxes, I have reviewed the complaint and the details of your property," Rebecca said. "As far as I can tell, you are not operating a commercial facility. You are simply allowing people to access trails on your private land. That does not require any special permits." "So the complaint is groundless?" I asked. "Essentially, yes. However, because a formal complaint was filed, I am required to conduct a site inspection. It is just a formality, but I need to come out and verify that you are not charging fees or operating any kind of business." We scheduled the inspection for the following week. Marcus and I met Rebecca at the trailhead on a clear morning in mid-October. We walked several of the main trails, and I showed her the signage and maintenance work I had done. She took notes and photos, asked a few questions, and seemed satisfied. "This all looks perfectly legitimate," Rebecca said. "I will file my report and close the complaint. You should not have any further issues." "Can you tell me who filed the complaint?" I asked. "It was submitted anonymously, so I do not have a name." But the return address on the envelope was from Portland. Patricia had moved to Portland after leaving Cascade Ridge. I was certain she had filed the complaint, hoping to cause me headaches and possibly force me to close the trails. When that did not work, she apparently decided to escalate. 2 weeks after the county inspection, I discovered that someone had vandalized one of the trailhead signs. The wooden post had been sawed partway through, and the sign itself was spray-painted with obscenities. I reported it to the Deschutes County Sheriff's Office and installed a motion-activated trail camera near the trailhead. 3 days later, the camera captured footage of Patricia and a man I did not recognize tampering with another trail sign. The video clearly showed their faces and their vehicle, a silver Lexus SUV with Oregon plates. I called the sheriff's office immediately. A deputy named Tom Garrison came out to review the footage. "That is definitely vandalism," Tom said, watching the video. "Do you know who these people are?" The woman is Patricia Alderson. She used to be the president of the Cascade Ridge HOA. We have a history. Tom raised an eyebrow. What kind of history? I explained the entire situation. The snowmobile ban, my purchase of the mountain, Patricia's forced resignation, and the subsequent lawsuit she had filed against me. Tom listened carefully, taking notes. So this appears to be an ongoing harassment campaign, he said. That actually makes things more serious. I am going to recommend that the district attorney file charges not just for the vandalism, but also for stalking and harassment. I just want her to leave me alone, I said. I understand. But Mr. Xerxes, based on what you are telling me, this woman has been targeting you for months. She has filed frivolous lawsuits, made false complaints to the county, and now she is physically vandalizing your property. That is a pattern of behavior that needs to be addressed. Tom took copies of the trail camera footage and the reports I had filed about the earlier vandalism. He also asked for documentation of Patricia's lawsuit and the county complaint. I provided everything he requested. 2 weeks later, Patricia Alderson was arrested at her home in Portland and charged with 2 counts of criminal mischief, 1 count of stalking, and 1 count of making a false report to a government agency. The stalking charge was based on the pattern of harassment that Tom had identified, including the lawsuit, the county complaint, and the vandalism. The false report charge stemmed from the anonymous complaint she had filed with the planning department. The news of her arrest spread quickly through Cascade Ridge. Gerald called me the day after it happened. "Brandon, I just heard about Patricia. Is it true? She has been arrested for vandalizing my trail signs and filing false complaints against me." Gerald was silent for a moment. I knew she was bitter about having to resign, but I never thought she would go this far. Honestly, I am not surprised. Patricia does not strike me as someone who handles losing very well. What happens now? That is up to the district attorney, but hopefully this is the end of it. Patricia's arraignment was scheduled for early November. Marcus advised me to attend, both to show the court that I was taking the matter seriously and to give the prosecutor a chance to speak with me directly. I drove to the Deschutes County Courthouse in Bend on a cold morning and sat in the gallery while Patricia was brought before the judge. She looked terrible. Her hair was not styled, her clothes were wrinkled, and she had dark circles under her eyes. She was represented by a public defender, which suggested she had burned through whatever money she had on the earlier lawsuit against me. The prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Amanda Chen, laid out the charges. The judge set bail at $10,000 and scheduled a preliminary hearing for December. Patricia's lawyer argued for lower bail, claiming she was not a flight risk and had no prior criminal record. The judge was unmoved. After the arraignment, Amanda pulled me aside. "Mr. Xerxes, I wanted to talk to you about the case. The evidence is very strong, especially the video footage. I am confident we can get a conviction if this goes to trial, but I wanted to ask what outcome you are hoping for." "I just want her to stop," I said. "I do not care about her going to jail. I just want to live my life without being harassed." Amanda nodded. "I will keep that in mind. The defense attorney will likely approach me about a plea deal. If they do, I will make sure any agreement includes a permanent restraining order and restitution for the damage she caused. That would be acceptable." The preliminary hearing was held in mid-December. I testified about the vandalism and the pattern of harassment. The defense attorney tried to paint me as a vindictive neighbor who had provoked Patricia by buying the mountain, but the judge was not buying it. Mr. Xerxes purchased property through legal means and exercised his legal rights as a property owner, the judge said. Even if Miss Alderson disagreed with his actions, that does not give her the right to vandalize his property or file false complaints. The preliminary hearing is concluded, and the case will proceed to trial unless a plea agreement is reached. The trial was scheduled for February, but it never happened. In early January, Patricia's lawyer contacted Amanda and offered to plead guilty to the criminal mischief charges in exchange for the stalking and false report charges being dropped. The plea agreement included a sentence of 2 years probation, 100 hours of community service, $3,000 in restitution for the damage and legal fees, and a permanent restraining order prohibiting Patricia from coming within 500 feet of me or Evergreen Mountain. Amanda called me to discuss the offer. It is not a perfect outcome, but it guarantees that she will face consequences and that you will be protected going forward. What do you think? I will take it, I said. I am done with this whole situation. The plea hearing was held on a gray afternoon in late January. Patricia stood before the judge and admitted to vandalizing my property. She was sentenced according to the plea agreement, and the restraining order was entered into the record. As she left the courtroom, she glanced at me with pure hatred in her eyes, but she said nothing. That was the last time I ever saw Patricia Alderson. With the legal drama finally behind me, I was able to focus on what I had originally wanted, enjoying the mountain. Winter that year was spectacular, with record snowfall that created perfect conditions for snowmobiling. I spent nearly every weekend on the trails, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends from Bend or neighbors from Cascade Ridge. The mountain became exactly what I had hoped it would be, a sanctuary. In March, the Cascade Wilderness Trust held a public event to celebrate the conservation easement on Evergreen Mountain. Victor invited local politicians, environmental advocates, and community members to a ceremony at the main trailhead. I gave a short speech about the importance of preserving wild spaces and thanked everyone who had supported the project. After the ceremony, a young couple approached me. The man extended his hand. "Mr. Xerxes, I am David and this is my wife Emily. We just moved to Cascade Ridge last month and we wanted to thank you for what you have done with this mountain. We have 2 young kids and it is amazing to have this kind of access right in our backyard." "You are very welcome," I said. "Just promise me you will take care of it." "Absolutely," Emily said. "Our kids are already obsessed with hiking. They ask to go up the trails almost every day." That conversation stuck with me. I had bought Evergreen Mountain out of anger and frustration, but it had become something much bigger than revenge against Patricia. It had become a legacy, something that would benefit people I would never meet long after I was gone. As spring turned to summer, I continued to develop the property. I added several new mountain biking trails, including a challenging downhill route that quickly became popular with serious riders. I organized volunteer trail maintenance days, and dozens of people from Bend and Cascade Ridge showed up to help clear brush, repair erosion, and install drainage systems. The mountain became a true community asset, something people took pride in. I also started thinking about the long-term future of the property. I was only 39 years old, but I knew I would not own the mountain forever. I met with Victor and the Cascade Wilderness Trust to discuss options for what would happen to Evergreen Mountain after my death. The conservation easement protects the land from development, but it does not determine who will own it, Victor explained. You could leave it to family, donate it to a land trust, or even establish your own nonprofit to manage it. I do not have kids, I said. And I am not close with my extended family. I want the mountain to stay public, or at least accessible to the public. Then, I would recommend establishing a nonprofit foundation now and transferring ownership to it in your will. That way, You can set the terms for how the land is managed, who has access, and how decisions are made. It also provides tax benefits during your lifetime. I like that idea. Over the next year, Marcus helped me establish the Evergreen Mountain Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to maintaining public access to the mountain and preserving its ecological health. I appointed a board of directors that included Victor, Gerald from the HOA, Rebecca from the county planning department, and 2 local environmental scientists. I donated an initial endowment to cover operating costs, and we began accepting additional donations from the public. The foundation took over day-to-day management of the trails, organized educational programs for local schools, and partnered with the Forest Service to monitor wildlife populations. It was more work than I had anticipated, but it was deeply rewarding. By the time I reached my 40th birthday in September, Evergreen Mountain had become something I never imagined when I first read Patricia's letter banning my snowmobile. It was not just my private playground or a symbol of victory over an overbearing HOA president. It was a genuinely important community resource that brought people together and protected a critical piece of wilderness. I still snowmobiled on the trails every winter. I still mountain biked in the summer. But now, I did it knowing that I was part of something larger than myself, something that would outlast the petty conflicts and personal grievances that had started this whole journey. One afternoon in late October, I was hiking one of the upper trails when I encountered a family I recognized from Cascade Ridge. The father, whose name I thought was Mark, waved as I approached. "Brandon, perfect timing. We were just talking about you." "All good things, I hope," I said. "Definitely. Our daughter Emma just finished a school project about local conservation efforts, and she wrote about Evergreen Mountain. She got an A. A girl who looked about 10 years old beamed at me. I interviewed Mr. Walsh from the Wilderness Trust, and he told me all about the conservation easement and how you are protecting animal habitats." "That is wonderful, Emma. Did you learn anything interesting?" "I learned that wolves might come back to this area because the mountain is protected now." "Is that true?" "It is possible," I said. "Wolves need large territories with healthy prey populations and safe corridors to move through. Evergreen Mountain helps provide that." Emma's face lit up. "That is so cool. I really want to see a wolf someday." "Maybe you will," I said. "Just remember to keep a safe distance if you do." We chatted for a few more minutes before the family continued on their hike. As I watched them disappear down the trail, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. This was why I had bought the mountain. Not to punish Patricia, although that had been deeply satisfying in the moment, but to protect something beautiful and important, and to make sure that kids like Emma would have access to wild places where they could learn and explore and fall in love with nature. The following month, I received an invitation to speak at a regional land conservation conference in Portland. Victor had nominated me, and the conference organizers wanted me to tell the story of Evergreen Mountain as a case study in creative conservation. I was hesitant at first, not being a public speaker, but Victor convinced me that the story was worth sharing. The conference was held at a hotel near the Portland waterfront. I gave my presentation to a room of about 200 people, including land trust professionals, government officials, and private landowners. I told them about Patricia's letter, my impulsive decision to buy a mountain, and how that act of spite had evolved into a genuine conservation success story. The audience laughed in the right places and applauded when I finished. During the question and answer session, a woman raised her hand. "Mr. Xerxes, you mentioned that you spent over $4 million to purchase Evergreen Mountain. Do you have any regrets about that investment?" I thought about it for a moment. Financially, it was not the smartest decision I have ever made. I could have invested that money in the stock market and probably made more money. But in terms of quality of life and personal satisfaction, it was the best $4 million I ever spent. I get to wake up every day knowing that I protected 3,000 acres of wilderness and that hundreds of people are enjoying it. You cannot put a price on that. The audience applauded again, and the moderator moved on to the next question. After the conference, several people approached me with their own stories of conflicts with HOAs or local governments. It turned out that my experience with Patricia was not unique. All over the country, people were dealing with overreaching HOAs, arbitrary rules, and petty tyrants on neighborhood boards. Some of the stories were almost comical in their absurdity. One man told me about an HOA that tried to ban him from flying an American flag in his yard. Another woman described a years-long battle over the color of her mailbox. But there were also stories of people who had pushed back successfully, who had organized their neighbors, voted out bad board members, or challenged illegal rules in court. I realized that my story, while dramatic, was just one example of a much larger pattern. HOAs could be useful organizations when run properly, but they could also become instruments of petty tyranny when the wrong people got into power. That conversation stayed with me on the drive back to Bend. I started thinking about ways to help other people who were dealing with similar situations. When I got home, I called Marcus. "I want to start another foundation," I said, "something that provides legal assistance to homeowners fighting abusive HOAs." Marcus laughed. "Brandon, you are on a foundation starting spree. What brought this on?" I told him about the conference and the conversations I had had with other homeowners. There are people all over the country who are being bullied by their HOAs, and most of them do not have the resources to fight back. I want to help them. That is a noble goal, Marcus said, but it is also going to be expensive and complicated. HOA law varies by state, and you would need to hire attorneys in multiple jurisdictions. I know, but I have the money and I have the time. I want to do something meaningful with both. We spent the next several months developing the concept. I established the Homeowner Defense Foundation, a nonprofit that provided free legal consultations and, in some cases, full legal representation to homeowners fighting against abusive HOA practices. We hired 3 lawyers to staff the foundation and set up a website where people could submit their cases for review. The response was overwhelming. Within the first month, we received over 500 inquiries from homeowners across the country. Most of the cases were relatively minor disputes that could be resolved with a strongly worded letter from an attorney. But some were serious situations involving illegal fines, fraudulent elections, or HOA boards that were literally stealing money from the association. We took on a dozen cases in the first year, focusing on situations where we could set precedents or force systemic changes. One case in Arizona involved an HOA that was foreclosing on homes over unpaid fines as small as $200. We represented 3 families whose homes were at risk and successfully argued that the HOA's foreclosure process violated state law. The case resulted in new regulations that made it much harder for HOAs in Arizona to foreclose over minor debts. Another case in Florida involved an HOA president who had embezzled over $50,000 from the association's maintenance fund. We helped the residents organize a special election, remove the corrupt board, and file criminal charges. The president was eventually convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Each victory felt good, but I was especially proud of the work we did in a small town in Colorado. The HOA there had banned solar panels, claiming they were aesthetically unpleasing. We represented a homeowner who wanted to install solar and argued that the ban violated state renewable energy laws. We won, and the HOA was forced to allow solar panels throughout the community. Within a year, over 30 homes in the development had installed solar systems. Running 2 foundations, managing Evergreen Mountain, and dealing with the inevitable bureaucracy that came with owning 3,000 acres kept me busy. But I loved it. For the first time in years, I felt like I was doing something important, something that mattered beyond my own personal enjoyment. I still made time for snowmobiling, of course. That was the whole point of buying the mountain in the first place. Every winter, on the anniversary of receiving Patricia's letter, I would take my snowmobile up to the highest point on Evergreen Mountain and spend a few hours riding the trails. It was my way of remembering where this all started, and how a single act of petty bureaucratic overreach had spiraled into something so much larger. 3 years after buying the mountain, I received an unexpected email from Deborah, the woman who had taken over as HOA president after Patricia resigned. She wanted to know if I would be willing to speak at the Cascade Ridge annual meeting about the history of Evergreen Mountain and the work the foundation was doing. I agreed, and on a warm evening in June, I stood in the same clubhouse where Patricia had once ruled with an iron fist and told my story to a room full of neighbors. I talked about the snowmobile ban, the decision to buy the mountain, the confrontation with Patricia, and everything that had happened since. I also talked about the importance of holding HOAs accountable and making sure they served the community rather than the egos of their leaders. When I finished, the room gave me a standing ovation. Several people came up afterward to thank me and to share their own experiences with Patricia. It turned out that my conflict with her had been just the tip of the iceberg. She had bullied and harassed dozens of residents over the years, and many people had moved out of Cascade Ridge specifically to get away from her. "You did us all a favor by standing up to her," one woman told me. "The community is so much better now that she is gone." I appreciated the sentiment, but I also felt a twinge of sadness. Patricia had been a deeply unhappy person who tried to find meaning and control in her life by dominating a neighborhood association. It was a tragic way to live, and while I did not regret confronting her, I wished things could have ended differently. But they had not ended differently, and there was no point dwelling on what might have been. Patricia was gone, the mountain was protected, and the community was thriving. That was what mattered. As I drove home that night, I thought about all the twists and turns that had brought me to this point. If Patricia had never sent that letter banning snowmobiles, I never would have bought Evergreen Mountain. If I had not bought the mountain, I never would have established the conservation easement or created the foundations. One petty act by one vindictive person had set off a chain reaction that changed my life, and in a small way, made the world a little better. It was a strange kind of gratitude I felt toward Patricia. Not for who she was or what she had done, but for the opportunity she had inadvertently given me to do something meaningful. In trying to take away something I loved, she had forced me to fight back, and that fight had led me down a path I never would have found otherwise. The following winter brought even more snow than usual, and Evergreen Mountain became a magnet for outdoor enthusiasts from all over Central Oregon. The trails were packed on weekends, and I had to work with the foundation to implement a permit system to prevent overuse and protect sensitive habitats. It was a good problem to have. One Saturday morning in February, I was preparing to head out for a ride when I noticed a television news van parked at the main trailhead. A reporter I recognized from the local NBC affiliate was interviewing skiers and snowmobilers about the mountain. I tried to slip past unnoticed, but the reporter spotted me. "Mr. Xerxes, do you have a moment?" I reluctantly agreed to an interview. The reporter asked about the history of the property, the conservation easement, and the impact the mountain had had on the community. It was all fairly standard stuff until she asked her final question. "There is a rumor that the woman who sparked this whole thing, Patricia Alderson, has been trying to get the conservation easement overturned. Can you comment on that?" I was genuinely surprised. "This is the first I am hearing of it. The easement is a legally binding agreement between me and the Cascade Wilderness Trust. I do not see how anyone could overturn it." She apparently filed a petition with the county claiming that the easement violates property rights and sets a dangerous precedent. "Do you have any response?" I sighed. Patricia Alderson does not own any property in Deschutes County, and she has no standing to challenge an agreement between me and a conservation organization. If she has filed some kind of petition, it will be dismissed. This is just more harassment from someone who cannot accept that she lost. The interview aired that evening, and by the next morning, my phone was flooded with messages of support. The petition Patricia had filed turned out to be even more frivolous than I had thought. She had submitted it to the county commissioners, claiming that conservation easements should be illegal because they restrict economic development. The commissioners responded with a polite but firm letter explaining that conservation easements are established legal tools used across the country, and that they had no authority to overturn a private agreement even if they wanted to. Patricia's petition went nowhere, but it did have one unintended consequence. The media coverage of her latest attempt to harass me drew attention to the Homeowner Defense Foundation, and donations poured in from people who wanted to support the work we were doing. Within a month, the foundation's endowment doubled, allowing us to hire 2 additional lawyers and take on more cases. In a strange way, Patricia was still helping me, even as she tried to tear down everything I had built. Spring that year arrived early, and by mid-March, the snow on the lower trails had melted enough to start transitioning to mountain biking season. I spent several weekends working with volunteers to clear winter debris and repair damage from freeze-thaw cycles. The work was hard but satisfying, and I enjoyed the camaraderie of working alongside people who cared about the mountain as much as I did. One afternoon, while we were repairing a washed-out section of trail, Gerald showed up with a cooler full of beer and sandwiches. We took a break and sat on a fallen log, looking out over the valley below. "You know, Brandon, when you first announced you were buying this mountain, I thought you were crazy," Gerald said. "I figured you would get bored with it after a year and sell it off to some developer." "I will admit, there were moments when I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake," I said. "Especially when the property tax bills started arriving." Gerald laughed. "But you stuck with it, and look what you have built. This mountain is the best thing that ever happened to Cascade Ridge." "It is the best thing that ever happened to me too," I said. "I just wish it had not taken someone like Patricia to push me into doing it." "Maybe that is the universe's way of working," Gerald said. "Sometimes it takes a terrible situation to force us into making positive changes." We finished our beers and got back to work. By sunset, the trail was repaired and ready for riders. As I drove home that evening, tired and covered in dirt, I felt deeply content. This was what life was supposed to be: hard work, good friends, and a sense of purpose. The years that followed were filled with similar moments. The Evergreen Mountain Foundation continued to grow, adding educational programs, trail running events, and partnerships with local schools. The Homeowner Defense Foundation took on more cases, winning important victories for homeowners and setting precedents that protected people from abusive HOA practices all over the country. I turned 45 before I knew it, then 50. The mountain became as much a part of my identity as my name. People in Bend knew me as the guy who bought the mountain, and I was fine with that. It was a better legacy than most people got. Patricia Alderson faded into obscurity. I heard through the grapevine that she had moved to Seattle, then to California, always searching for a new community to control. But she never found another Cascade Ridge, and she never filed another lawsuit or petition against me. The restraining order remained in effect, and as far as I knew, she stayed far away from Deschutes County. I sometimes wondered if she ever reflected on what she had done, if she ever realized that her attempt to control me had backfired so spectacularly. But I doubted it. People like Patricia rarely engaged in that kind of self-reflection. They just moved on to the next target, the next fight, the next opportunity to exert power over others. On the 10th anniversary of buying Evergreen Mountain, the Cascade Wilderness Trust organized a celebration at the main trailhead. Hundreds of people showed up, including local politicians, environmental advocates, and families from Cascade Ridge and beyond. Victor gave a speech about the importance of private conservation and thanked me for my vision and commitment. When it was my turn to speak, I stood before the crowd and looked out at the mountain rising behind them. 10 years ago, I received a letter from my HOA banning me from doing something I loved, I began. I was angry. I was frustrated. And I made an impulsive decision to buy this mountain as an act of revenge. But what started as spite turned into purpose. This mountain has given me more than I ever gave it. It has given me a community, a mission, and a reason to get up every morning. It has taught me that sometimes the best response to pettiness and control is not more pettiness, but generosity and openness. I did not buy this mountain to keep people out. I bought it to make sure everyone could enjoy it, now and forever. The crowd erupted in applause. I stepped down from the podium and spent the rest of the afternoon hiking with friends, talking to visitors, and watching kids run up and down the trails with boundless energy. As the sun began to set and people started heading home, I climbed to a high point on the mountain where I could see for miles in every direction. The Cascade Range stretched out before me, peak after peak disappearing into the distance. Somewhere out there, Patricia Alderson was living her life, probably making someone else miserable. But here, on this mountain, hundreds of people had spent the day celebrating something beautiful and permanent. I thought about that letter again, the one that had started everything. It was still in a drawer in my cabin, folded and creased from being read so many times. I had kept it as a reminder of why I did what I did, but also as a reminder of how quickly anger can turn into something constructive if you channel it the right way. Patricia Alderson had tried to take something away from me, and in doing so, she had given me the motivation to create something far greater than she could have imagined. The mountain was not just mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who hiked its trails, everyone who donated to the foundation, everyone who fought against abusive HOAs because they heard my story and found the courage to stand up for themselves. That was the real victory. Not humiliating Patricia or forcing her to resign, but building something that would outlast both of us, something that would bring joy and wonder to people I would never meet. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, I made my way back down the mountain. My snowmobile was waiting in the garage, ready for the next winter. The trails would need maintenance in the spring. The foundations would need oversight and funding. There was always more work to be done, but for now, I was content. I had taken a petty act of bureaucratic overreach and turned it into a legacy. I had taken anger and transformed it into purpose. And I had proven that sometimes the best revenge is not revenge at all, but building something so good, so meaningful that the person who wronged you becomes irrelevant. Patricia Alderson had banned my snowmobile from the trails, so I bought the mountain and opened it to everyone. In the end, that was the only response that mattered.